Welcome to our talk on post-truth, science denialism, and the vagaries of normative deviance in inquiry. I'm Filippo Ferrari from the University of Padua.
And I'm Sebastiano Moruzzi from the University of Bologna.
So the aim of this talk is to develop a model for understanding an important aspect of the general phenomenon of post-truth, namely what we call science denialism. And our main thesis in this talk is that science denialism brings about a significant deviance in what we take to be the standard epistemic norms governing inquiry.
The structure of the talk is as follows. In part 1, we describe inquiry and its normative setting. In part 2, we define the notions of background assumption and epistemic filter. In part 3, we assess background assumption, and in part 4, we describe the varieties of normative deviance. But before proceeding, we would like to mention that there is an extended handout available in the upload folder for those of you who are interested in knowing more details about our proposal. The structure of the handout follows that of the presentation, but it contains more information about our models and also a discussion of a case study, namely no-vaxxers.
In this first part, we characterize inquiry as a practice regulated by two sets of norms. So on the one hand, we have alitic norms, namely norms that have to do with the truth of our beliefs. And on the other hand, we have epistemic norms, namely norms that concern the evidential status of our beliefs. Our main claim in this session is that even if we keep the total evidence fixed and we leave the norms unchanged, there might be important variability in the epistemic situation of the subject, a variability that leads to variations in what is epistemically required and what is epistemically permitted to believe in inquiry. And our main thesis is then that some of these variations might give rise to normative deviances in inquiry that are characteristic of science denialism. We take inquiry to be a practice, in particular the practice of gathering, weighting, and assessing evidence, which is aimed at forming, managing, and revising beliefs for the sake of acquiring and sharing true information. As all practices, also inquiry is regulated by norms. In particular, two sets of norms are relevant for our talk. So the first one is what we what we call double analytic standard, which says that truth is both the aim of inquiry and also the standard for correctness for belief. And the other set of norms that are relevant for our purposes is what we call evidential norms, so which are justification norms. And in particular, so norms for the formation of belief on the basis of available evidence, and norms for the revision of belief, also on the basis of available evidence, as you can see on this slide. So these two norms fix the intentions of the concept permissible and required, epistemically permissible and epistemically required. So the extension of this concept is determined by their intentions plus what we call the epistemic situation of an inquiring subject. So the epistemic situation features various elements that constitutes the perspective of the inquirer on the evidence. So for example, what background assumptions are operative in the context of inquiry. And we will say more on this later. With all this in hand, we can now formulate one of our main theses, namely the epistemic variability thesis, according to which a variation of the epistemic situation of the inquiring subject might determine a change in the extension of the normative concept. So a disclaimer is important at this point. This epistemic variability thesis doesn't entail that all inquiries are equal in good standing. Some inquiries are better than others, and we will soon explain how this is so.
In this part, we specify what the epistemic situation of an inquiry subject is by discussing two key notions, that of a background assumption and that of an epistemic filter. These two notions play a fundamental role in delimiting the scope of the epistemic norms, namely the body of evidence on which EN1 and EN2 range. In so doing, they shape the extension of the normative concept epistemically permissible and required. Let's first introduce the notion of background assumption. Background assumptions are beliefs that are central for defining the epistemic situation of a subject. More specifically, they contribute to the epistemic self-conception of the inquiring subject. By epistemic self-conception, we mean the conception that the subject has of herself, qua inquirer, what kind of inquirer she takes herself to be. Background assumptions provide a twofold epistemic assessment. On the one hand, they provide assessment on the evidential sources, for example, assessments such as scientific institutions are reliable or oracles are unreliable. And on the other hand, they provide assessment on the nature or kind of evidence, as for example, whether or not only certain evidence is trustworthy. The second notion we would like to introduce is that of an epistemic filter. An epistemic filter is a selection function which takes as inputs the total evidence and the set of the inquirer background assumptions, and outputs a demarcation of the body of evidence on which the epistemic norms range. There are two types of epistemic filters: omitting filter and discrediting filter. An omitting filter is one way of restricting the scope of the epistemic norms by omitting certain pieces of evidence due to the specific epistemic locality of an agent. For example, certain sources are excluded because they are not reachable by the subject. A discrediting filter is another way in which the scope is limited. In this case, the epistemic filter restricts the pool of evidence over which the epistemic norms range by discrediting some sources of evidence. One way to make sense of this distinction between omitting and discrediting filter is to distinguish these two types of filter by changing the scope of the normative operator in the epistemic norms EN1 and EN2. See the handout for details on this further point.
Is it possible to provide an epistemic assessment of background assumptions? And if so, how does such an assessment work? In our view, any background assumption can be subject to an epistemic assessment. Specifically, some forms of deviant inquiries whose normatively extensions are determined by what we would intuitively call bad filters are indeed bad forms of inquiry. We call these inquiries normatively aberrant inquiries. Normatively aberrant inquiries score low on the alethic telos, since they fail to include effective evidence and to exclude ineffective one for forming and revising beliefs, thus failing to maximize true beliefs and to minimize false ones. Moreover, a normatively aberrant inquiry might worsen its epistemic status by being also hardly reformable, namely not open to change its background assumptions. There are two dimensions of assessment of an inquiry and its background assumption. On the one hand, we have the degree of fulfillment of the alethic telos, namely how well does inquiry score on maximizing truth and on minimizing falsity. And on the other hand, we have what we call reformability, namely to what extent are inquiry's background assumptions open to reform. When the assessment is negative, we have what we have called a normatively aberrant inquiry. So if it turns out that an inquiry employs background assumptions that are false, this inquiry will operate with the evidence selected on the basis of false evaluations of epistemic sources, and it will likely perform badly in maximizing truth and in minimizing falsity. This is because false background assumptions have a structural impact on inquiry, since they contribute to determining an extension of epistemic permissions and obligation that systematically fail to effectively guide the inquiring subject towards truth. Concerning non-reformability, so if the background assumptions of an aberrant inquiry are also resistant to being reformed in light of defeating evidence, then the resulting inquiry is overall in a worse epistemic shape than an aberrant inquiry open to being reformed. So let me say something more on this point, resistance to reformability. So reformability of an inquiry is challenged by a twofold line of resistance. So on the one hand, we have the inquirer's dispositions, modulo preserving her epistemic self-conception, to hold on to background assumption due to their privileged epistemic and normative status within inquiry. On the other hand, we have the width of the epistemic filters, namely how much evidence they filter out. So the narrower the width of the epistemic filters is, the easier it is for an inquiring subject to overcome her attachment to background assumptions, given the size of the overwhelming defeating evidence she may be subject to. This is because ignoring such evidence would jeopardize her epistemic self-conception in a much more daunting way than abandoning background assumptions. As a consequence, the extremely high degree of confidence characteristic of background assumption is most stable when epistemic filters are wide, since they filter out a larger body of potentially defeating evidence.
A normatively deviant inquiry is an inquiry whose normative extension diverges from the one of scientific inquiry as standardly conceived. Normative deviance may lead to a very different kinds of inquiry, ranging from skepticism to science denialism. In this part, we illustrate how the normative extension of inquiry can be shaped by means of discrediting filter, thus leading to cases of science denialism. The kind of inquiry characteristic of science denialism, which we shall call post-inquiry, employs conspiracy theories as background assumptions. Such conspiracy theories are unlikely to be true and often hardly reformable. This figure represents the different ways in which the range of the epistemic norm of revision can be shaped by a discrediting filter. You can find in a handout an analogous chart for the norm of belief. We represent evidence as consisting of sets of propositions. Thus, each frame in the figure is the result of the application of an epistemic filter by selecting those propositions which count as candidate defeaters, namely potential defeating evidence. A change in the set of candidate defeaters involves a change in the normative extension of epistemic obligation, namely the extension of being epistemically required to revise a belief. At the center of the figure, you can find the normative extension of scientific inquiry as standardly conceived. Epistemic filters can either widen or narrow the normative extension with respect to scientific inquiry. These variations give rise to normative deviances. The figure features several characters representing a variety of normative deviances. For the purposes of this talk, we will focus on the guarded enquirer and the post-enquirer, but you can find a description of the other character in the handout. Now, at the outermost frame, you can find the guarded enquirer. The inquiry of the guarded enquirer includes epistemic possibilities as candidate defeaters for empirical propositions. If an epistemic possibility cannot be refuted, such a possibility is sufficient to trigger the norm of revision in relation to the targeted belief. Thus, this kind of inquiry has the widest range of evidence available for revising beliefs. This is the typical normative framework for Cartesian skepticism. The innermost frame of the figure is inhabited by the post-enquirer. The inquiry of the post-enquirer excludes institutional sources of evidence. By means of a conspiracy theory, having specific feature, more on this shortly, the evidence coming from scientific institution is filtered out, thus having low epistemic standards and a low degree of reformability.
An effective way to explain how a conspiracy theory engenders a normatively aberrant form of inquiry is to take it to belong to a special class of conspiracy theories identified by Kassim-Kassan. These conspiracy theories have 6 core features. First, they are speculative, because they are based on conjectures lacking solid evidence. For instance, there is no solid evidence of the anti-vaxxers' claim that vaccines cause autism. Second, they are contrarian because they are against the obvious explanation of events. For instance, although the Lancet has motivated the retraction of the infamous Wakefield's paper on the basis of scientific evidence and methodological misgivings, some anti-vaxxers claim that such a retraction was an inside job performed to cover up the truth on vaccines. Third, they are esoteric because they make use of bizarre explanation. For instance, it is bizarre to claim that the Center for Disease and Control promotes vaccination because of a secret depopulation agenda, as anti-vaxxers maintain. Fourth, they are amateurish because those who argue for these theories are typically not experts in the relevant fields. For instance, anti-vaxxers are not virologists nor epidemiologists, but at best general practitioners. Fifth, they are premodern in that they express a worldview where, as Kassam puts it, complex events are capable of being controlled by a small number of people acting in secret. And this is what gives these events a deeper meaning. For instance, it is premodern to think, as anti-vaxxers do, that global health policies and the related scientific research agendas are the result of a decisions of a small group of people guided by financial interests. The fact that certain conspiracy theories have these features explain why they are unlikely to be true. Therefore, any inquiries whose background assumptions are based on conspiracy theories with C features 1 to 5 is bound to score badly on the degree of fulfillment of dialectic telos. But Kassam adds a sixth features to the list, what he calls self-sealing features, which says that believers in these conspiracy theories belong to a belief bubble whose assumptions have a special role, namely anyone who questions them is excluded from the bubble. Now, this last features is connected to our notion of reformability, in that it indicates a strong resistance of an inquiry to be reformed. Many sources that may provide defeating evidence for background assumptions are neutralized because excluded by the epistemic filters. These features is evident in the sectarian attitude that many anti-vaxxers and other science denialists have towards debunking evidence. Whenever an inquiry is regulated by an epistemic filter based on background assumptions involving a conspiracy theory with the C features, it engenders a normatively aberrant kind of inquiry, which we shall call post-inquiry. More precisely, featuring a background assumption based on conspiracy theory which satisfies C features 1 to 5 is sufficient for an inquiry to be normatively aberrant and thus a post-inquiry. If such a conspiracy theory also satisfies C feature 6, namely it is self-sealing, we have a form of post-inquiry which is particularly recalcitrant to being reformed and thus normatively even more aberrant. We think that the case of anti-vax inquiry, as well as the case of flat earth inquiry, are clear examples of post-inquiries. Furthermore, to close our talk with a rather topical issue, it is interesting to notice that almost immediately after the appearance and spreading of the COVID-19 pandemic, several denialists have claimed that the virus either does not exist or that it has been the invention of governments for imposing a strict regime of social control on countries and societies. We think that the model we have sketched in this talk might be useful to explain why a genuine debate between these communities of denialists and scientific institutions is so hard to achieve. Our hope is that further developments of this model could help not only in fostering awareness of this difficulty, but also in understanding how to better cope with a variety of post-truth phenomena, and in particular with science denialism.
Thank you very much for attending our talk. We would like to remind you that in case you're interested in knowing more about our proposal, that we have uploaded on an extended handout in the shared folder on Teams.
And please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you wish so at the following addresses:
sebastiano.moruzzi@unibo.it
and f.q.ferrari@gmail.com. Thank you again.
Bye.